Welcome. You're on the Fringe show. I'm your host, Tatiana Zalan, and I go live every Friday at 2 p.m. Dubai time. The Fringe helps you to navigate the rapidly changing world and increase the odds of your success. Here we discuss technology, startups, and mental models of successful people so that you too can take advantage of the opportunities in the new digital world. Today is episode 51, and it's a continuation of my last show, show number 50, if you want to check it out. And that's a review of the book, The Network State, How to Start a New Country by Balaji Srinivasan. It was probably one of the most anticipated book releases of 2022 in the tech community and beyond the tech community. Its key argument, as I said before, is that you can start a country from your computer, just like you start a startup, and you can build a digital first and physical second. That's really the key argument, the primacy of the digital first, the digital world. And in this episode, I will review the rest of the chapters. In the first one, I did chapter 1 and 2, and here I'm doing chapters 3 to 5. The usual disclaimer, the views that I express here are my own. They do not represent the official views of organizations or employees that I'm associated with. And although I do mention cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, it's not investment advice. The Fringe is for educational purposes only. Now, starting with chapter 3, which is called the tripolar moment, most of you will probably be aware that we're moving on to a multipolar world, and Srinivasan has got his own version of it, and it's called the tripolar moment. What are the three poles? Well, it's NYT, or New York Times, CCP, Chinese Communist Party, and BTC, Bitcoin. So NYT, CCP, and BTC. And he has this, maybe you can call it a graph, with a vertical axis, which is two extremes of authoritarian versus libertarian, and then the horizontal axis with two extremes of economic left and economic right. And within these extremes, within these poles, he locates CCP, Communist Capital, New York Times, Woke Capital, and BTC, Crypto Capital. It will become clearer what he means by it. These three worlds, as he says, are different on almost every dimension. That includes source of truth, of power, of legitimacy, of technopolitics, and leadership. Each of these poles has a source of truth online. New York Times, NYT, that's paper, party, that's CCP, or protocol, that's BTC. Each has a digital economy that surrounds that sort of truth, the dollar economy, the digital yuan, and the Web3 cryptocurrency. Each pole is sort of a network in its own right. And then he goes into describing these poles and the capital that underlies each of the poles in a bit more detail. As he says, the NYT network gives direction to the American state, that the CCP network leads the Chinese state, the BTC network stands outside all states, and each has, in the end, a governing ideology. So what are these governing ideologies in his view? Well, woke capital is the ideology of America's ruling class at the moment, and that's very much translates into what kind of articles NYT writes. It's capitalism that enables decentralized censorship, cancel culture, and American empire. He calls it drone strike democracy. So it will be very clear to you in this chapter and in chapter 4 that he clearly detests wokeness, and we share this sentiment, I would say. Then there is communist capital. That's the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party. It's capitalism checked by centralized power of the Chinese party state. And then finally, there is crypto capital, which is the international ideology of Bitcoin and Web3. It's status capitalism. It's capitalism without corporations, decentralized censorship resistance, and neutral international law. And it's the second pole between, or rather within, both the US and China, the one that domestic regime opponents align around. So why are these three, maybe you will ask yourself? Well, according to him, because it's the only the only coalitions with a billion-person scale and technological talent to survive as independent power centers in the current digital struggle. The network society, the startup society rather, ultimately becomes a network state. And that ideally combines the elements or aspects of all these three poles. It has a clear founder to provide direction, but it also ensures that every citizen has the right to freely leave should they want to leave the network. Then there are coin holders, of course, that have a say, and a number of other checks and balances. He returns back to this concept again in further on, and that's really what he calls re-centralized center. My only comment here would be, I definitely find this very interesting as an idea, but many analysts will disagree with this idea of billion-person scale. If you look at the macro zones that are being formed now, like in the US and China, within the current techno-economic paradigm, that's a fancy word that economists are very often using. Well, within this techno-economic paradigm, you can actually have a very viable macro zone of 300 million, and it doesn't certainly need to be digital only. This is what kind of the current state of thought is. Now we're moving on to chapter 4, which he calls decentralization, re-centralization. And that to me perhaps was the most interesting chapter because it discusses a range of possible futures. And I'm really very much into understanding what awaits us, what's the future for humanity, future for our economic system, and so on. By and large, he believes that a re-centralized center that we mentioned before will emerge as kind of a center of pragmatic network states, and he describes several scenarios under which this could happen. Like with any scenarios, any future thinking, you need to be thinking about things like volatility and limits of predictability, generally speaking. He sees the world through two lenses, and he describes in a lot of detail what he means by, well, say, the socio-political lens and techno-economic lens. What are the components of that? But we won't go into that, or I won't go into that. One of the key ideas here, though, I think that's the most important thing, is that's his premise of the primacy of the digital world. All value, according to him, all the economic value becomes digital. And he certainly goes into a lot of depth to prove this point. Just a couple of examples. During the pandemic, every sector that had previously been socially resistant to the internet, like healthcare, education, law, finance, government itself, he said, capitulated. And everything, he believes, starts on the computer, generates cryptocurrency. It can be used either to buy digital goods or to pay robots, perhaps to materialize things into the physical world. Of course, he believes that humans still exist, but the economy will become the crypto economy. All value will go digital. I personally strongly disagree with this premise for reasons that I'll explain later on at the very end of this show. I'll save it till the end. So what are these future scenarios that he sees? One is American anarchy, and that's he thinks that could be a second American Civil War that's triggered in part by a broke US government that attempts Bitcoin seizure. Actually, this is, although it seems a little bit too much, probably, it's not that that off. A lot of analysts believe that this could happen and America could be split in two zones. But according to him, it's not a physical war, it's rather a war to control your mind, a network to network war, not a state to state war to control territory. The US in particular to him is a fractured country and society. Certainly agree with that. Then there is the Chinese control scenario number 2, where the CCP implements an intense domestic crackdown on the other side of the world to maintain stability, and that will prevent Chinese people from freely leaving the digital yuan network with their property. And of course, it will be, and it is already, AI-powered society. The Chinese control scenario, he calls it dystopian. It's dystopian to the freedom seeking, to the ambitious people, but it may be acceptable to those people who prize stability over everything else. And then there is a third scenario, which is the international intermediate. It includes essentially everyone from the world that want to avoid, the American anarchy and the Chinese control scenario. It could be American centrists, Chinese liberals, Indians, Israelis, Web3 technologists, and so on and so forth. So he asks this question, well, do you go with the failed centralization of the New York Times and the declining US establishment, the total decentralization of Bitcoin maximalists, or perhaps the totalitarian centralization of the CCP? Well, instead of having this or having to choose between anarchic decentralization or coercive centralization, as we see in the Chinese Communist Party, people would rather choose, according to Balaji, volitional, what he calls volitional re-centralization. So these are the scenarios, and now we're moving on to chapter 5, which is kind of the summary of some of the ideas that he fleshed out before, but also he talks a little bit more about why a network state is feasible as an idea. Really, that's the key message of chapter 5. It is feasible. And this is how we should be thinking about it. He first starts with an overview of what a traditional nation state is in the physical world. And if you take, for example, the definition of Britannica, it's a territorially bounded sovereign polity. Let me see exactly the definition, that is ruled in the name of a community of citizens that identify themselves as a nation. And this latter bit he says is key, because a nation state is not just a government that controls a territory. It's supposed to be a government that represents distinct people and a nation. There are 6 essential parts of the state. There is borders, regulations, central government, international sovereignty, diplomatic recognition, and the domestic monopoly on violence. So that's a nation state. What is a nation? He asks another question. Well, there is a fair bit of variation here. There are nations with states, like Japanese or Spanish, nations without states, Kurds and Catalonians, and nations with partially sovereign states, that would be Taiwan. In general, the idealized nation state is where all the members of a given group, the nation, are physically centralized within a single set on the surface of the globe. So physical presence is clearly very important. The network state, he says, starts from essentially a different assumption than the nation-state system. And then he drills down the proposed definition and explains why a network state is feasible. And just to remind you again, what is a network state? Is a social network, that's the exact citation here, social network with a moral innovation, a sense of national consciousness, a recognized found their capacity for collective action, an in-person level of civility, and an integrated cryptocurrency, consensual government limited by a social smart contract, an archipelago of crowd-funded physical territories, a virtual capital, and an on-chain census that proves a large enough population, income, and real estate footprint to attain a measure of diplomatic recognition. And we can see that this idea of diplomatic recognition is running through the whole book. So that's the ultimate state, diplomatic recognition from some pre-existing governments, which requires far more substance, leadership, physical presence, and long-term commitment than a typical online community or even a cryptocurrency. So that's important. This diplomatic recognition is important for legitimacy and sovereignty. There is a certain sequence in establishing, or a path, if you will, path to establishing a network state. It doesn't really start with diplomatic recognition all of a sudden. It starts with smaller steps, with network unions. Then we move on to network archipelagos, and finally to network states. And he likens it to seed, Series B, and public companies listings. How much effort it takes to build each of these states. And Srinivasan does allude quite a fair bit in his work to, of course, startups, because that's where his one of his competencies is, and expertise as well. And so he defines this path to the network state, starting with network union, which is a wholly digital entity organized as a social tree structure that engages in collective action on behalf of its members. This collective action is really key to building organizational muscle, as he calls it. Then there is the second stage is network archipelago, that's Series B, a network union that begins acquiring and networking properties in the physical world. The physical interaction here is key for building trust. And we end up with network state, a network archipelago that gains diplomatic recognition from at least one legacy state. And this diplomatic recognition is key for attaining sovereignty. Why would we want a network state and we'll start from scratch? Well, three reasons. It's really easy to do that way, then reform the old. We can begin anew without baggage. And for some tech, like life extension, for example, we need fundamentally new jurisdictions to avoid bureaucracy that goes with it. He's also mentioning a few things about the enablers of the network state. Why can it exist? Like the internet itself, then the Bitcoin, which constrains legacy states, as a government of governments, which he says Bitcoin, it guarantees the sovereignty of both the individual citizen, but also the network state itself. Web3 is a third enabler, and that enables new chains, decentralized entities, and censorship resistance communities. Then remote and Starlink open up the map. Mobile makes us more mobile. Then there is VR, AR, social media, and finally GAFAM showed us what's possible, and startups and VC showed us how. And his very, very last paragraph in the book is this. The nation state was enabled by maps of the world, tools to communicate laws, and the guns to enforce them. The network state is enabled by the creation of a new world, the internet, the software to code and communicate policies, and the cryptography to enforce them. So that's the very last bit in his book. Now, as a conclusion, I want to go through a bit of a summary and some unanswered questions for myself. Firstly, I want to really be very clear about it. I loved it. It's this book is a great addition to a library. I don't agree with all the premises, with how he sees the world, with some bits of history. I think, but I think it's really deserves a place on your bookshelf. Is the network state the new Leviathan? Which was the question that he asked at the beginning. Well, my answer to that is maybe. Is this a new vision? A new vision of a new system? No, it's not. It's still capitalism, and the network state is really an improvement on the existing capitalist system. By the way, I said that before. It's likely that Srinivasan never set himself the goal of coming up with kind of a vision of the replacement of the current system. To me, personally, this book is a lot more useful on how to create online communities rather than network state and nations. I found the ideas of what is a legitimate founder or the idea of one commandment very, very useful. The question that's not very clear to me and that is still unanswered is about economic value and how this will be created. It's not quite clear apart from the fact that it's digital, but what about public services? What about healthcare and education? Surely we cannot digitize all of that all of a sudden. What about huge infrastructure projects like roads and railways? Will there be some scope for these kind of projects? How is this funded? Is there a role for taxation at all? We don't know. To me, that this kind of a project also comes with considerable risks because network states, at least at the very beginning, are these sort of supranational entities that feed off on what citizens in these states have created and own, and are using the infrastructure built in the traditional physical world. That's, of course, the internet and cloud, and hence the risk. Well, what about if someone pulls the plug? What about deplatforming? We've seen that over and over again. I also think that the thesis of the primacy of the digital world, bits over physical atoms, is overstretched. It's worth mentioning that the digital world exists only because of the physical world. And let me give you some statistics here. Energy consumption of telecommunications, IT, internet, all these related industries related to bits, is currently 30% of all energy consumption. And this doesn't even include goods production. So under the current techno-economic paradigm, this is unsustainable and really heading for collapse. You must be blind not to notice that all the current global skirmishes are really about who owns what natural resources. The natural resources treasury, so to speak, is far, far more valuable than any IT-related tech. We need to change the techno-economic paradigm, not only technical, but also human. And I'm glad to see that Peter Thiel, who Srinivasan mentions many times in the book, is kind of very supportive of this idea. And that's his direct quote. I think we've had a lot of innovation in computers, information technology, internet, mobile internet, in the world of bits. Not so much in the world of atoms, supersonic travel, space travel, new forms of energy, new forms of medicine, new medical devices, and so on. It's sort of been this two-track area of innovation. I very much agree with that statement. Then I personally have a question about founders. How are they going to be compensated for the risks they take and the work they do? In startups, it's easy, it's equity. What's the equivalent of that in the network state? And who will inhabit this network state? Who are the citizens? Who is included? Who is excluded? And it is my fear that this network state will amplify what analysts, historians, and researchers of elites call new cosmopolitan elites, people that don't have necessarily any national allegiance, if you will. The entire world is now witnessing the process of stratification of the capitalist class society, most likely into a case society. We will have, or we already have, a very small, tiny percentage of the population, probably 0.1% of people, super wealthy elites. Then there is 10% of the population who serve these elites, intellectuals like myself, technocrats and the military, and then the rest of the population, and that's 90%. Who are they? Useless eaters, as some people call them, possibly existing on UBI, Universal Basic Income. And my final comment is that, well, the good news about Balaji's book is actually a state which has a network state, you can call it, that has some of the features. In fact, many of the features of the network state already exists. It's called Asgardia. I was hoping to find a reference to this particular, well, state or nation state, but I didn't, so that was a bit of a surprise for me. It's this project, let's call it a project, is officially named Space Kingdom of Asgardia. It was established in 2016. It was done by Dr. Igor Ashurbeili, who is a scientist, an Azerbaijani scientist, and this is when he announced the creation of the first space nation. He's a very credible founder, PhD in engineering, specialization in computer science, also worked on rockets launch, which he did. Then it's a country with, we're not quite clear, at least it's not quite clear to me how big the population is. Some people are saying it's more than 1 million from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the US. Other data show that it's actually 290,000 people plus, or citizens plus, over 1 million followers all around the world. This project or state has got its own constitution, parliament, flag, and anthem, and it released its 3 own satellites into the space. And they would be very much wanting to get legitimacy, diplomatic legitimacy. They want to be recognized by the UN, and they have applied for it. The problem with it, I think I read it somewhere, that it's probably going to be legal and has to do with space exploration. And this is how this is treated according to international law. It has, it doesn't have one commandment as Balaji would have suggested, but it does have its own mission. It aims to unite people in transnational, equal, and progressive society. And they have their own key scientific goal, and that's to facilitate the first human childbirth in space. And that's, according to them, it's a crucial step on our path to immortality as a human species. They are creating this fully fledged, independent digital state and digital economy. It's a decentralized economic system, just like Srinivasan has suggested. It is powered by cryptocurrency. The cryptocurrency is called Solar, and it's a stable coin which is pegged to euro, 1-to-1, backed by funds deposited in international bank. And according to the legislation, or in Asgardia, every citizen must be a participant in the distribution of the nation's profits. Not quite clear whether there are any profits, but they expect some. Well, I think I will stop here. I hope you enjoyed this review, second part of the review. Some of my thoughts here I've thrown here and there, how I think about the world, but definitely this book is worth your read, worth your time. It's got plenty of ideas, so many that you probably will be overwhelmed. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me today, and I will see you next Friday at 2 p.m. Dubai time. All the best.